Um, Good morning, everyone. As Phil said, please mute yourselves if you're not muted already. Thank you for joining us. We've got several hundred people on the call, which is fantastic. My name is James Robinson. I'm the founder and director of Woburn Partners, which is a corporate comms and crisis communications company. Before I introduce Stig, Abell and Phil, I'll just quickly set out what we were trying to do today, which is simply to ask about Times Radio, which launches on Monday, talk about the reasons that News UK are launching the station with Stig, who is the launch director of Times Radio. We're going to do that by interviewing Stig. Phil's going to ask some questions. Stig's going to answer the questions, talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll have some questions from all of you at home. So before I do that, by a brief way of introduction, Stig, as I say, is the launch director of Times Radio. He's the executive editor at News UK's radio division Wireless. And he has the rare distinction of having been one of the few people alive to have worked at a very senior level at both the London Review of Books and the Sun newspaper, having been editor until very recently of the LRB and managing editor of the Sun for some time before that. He's also held a number of other senior positions in the media and is a broadcaster and columnist as well. So a Renaissance man, and now faced with the very big task of launching a major national radio station in a matter of days. So I want to say, Stig, we really appreciate you making the time for us today, just a few days out from launching the station. And Phil, I'll hand over to Phil, Director of Broadcast Revolution, to ask you some questions.
Thanks, James. And again, thanks, Stig, for joining us. I know you said you've got lots of rehearsals that you need to be getting to, so really appreciate your time. So let's just, first of all, sorry, just say, we've already had some questions come in from the audience. Any other questions, please do tweet them to @BroadcastRevo, and we'll get as many questions as we can through. So, Stig, let's start with, like, what was the reason behind sort of the creation of Times Radio?
Well, it probably goes back. The company News UK bought Wireless, which is the radio arm of the company now, back in 2016, with the idea, I think, if you look at the quotes they said at the time, was we got these newspaper brands, we've got these this sort of publishing arm, but if we get radio stations, how can we make it all work as a sort of global media hub, if you like? And so I think from the very beginning, they had a sense of how do you bring the things a bit closer together, because then you can get broader audiences, you can cross-sell stuff. That was always in their mind. And then probably a year ago, they did some serious work on thinking, is there a proposition that would work for the Times? Because the Times is a pretty successful subscription business. Going behind the paywall, kind of worked for the Times and has done for several years. But the question for all subscription businesses is, how do you grow the audience? And the idea, I think, was to say, can we create a radio station that will lure people in? I think someone needs to mute. There we go. Will lure people into the Times universe so they can start experience the product a bit more. The other argument, which is equally, if not more pressing, is how do we create a national radio station from scratch that will work as a national radio station? It's very hard to do that. It's very hard to do that at any level of cost, unless you have the ability to work into a couple of big newsrooms that already exist. So the Times and the Sunday Times already exist. They have journalists all around the world. They have a commitment to journalism to a high level of it. And so the thinking was, can we make use of some of that journalistic heft? Can we create a product that stands alone, for which there's a niche, there's a hole in the market, and people will turn to it to listen to it. It will kind of have a certain commercial presence as well, because we can get shows sponsored. We can do deals across the whole of the Times network. So you could do a deal with the Times, the Sunday Times, Times Radio, a digital side of things, and you kind of have a whole package you can offer. And really, it will be a place to get people in to a world where they start thinking warmly about Times and Sunday Times. And in the end, that will grow the overall business, the Times business. And that's really the aim of the game now. Everyone wants to try and grow the audience and then find ways to have a commercial relationship with them.
So, so if we get into the nitty-gritty, that'd be great. Oh, there we go. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the show, can you talk to us about how close, as you were sort of touching on, the newspaper, the Times and the Sunday Times, will work either as one newsroom or annexed newsrooms, putting together, Times Radio?
So it's a combination, really. Firstly, we wanted to make sure we didn't want to do this and just say to a load of Times journalists, you've never broadcast before, come on and bear the whole responsibility for carrying the station. So you'll see from our presenter lineup, we've got people from quite a wide range of places, some BBC people, some people who've done LBC. That's true of the production and editing side of things. As well, we've got making use of some Times journalists. So Matt Chorley has a show which is really an extension of a very good podcast he does on politics. Hugo Rifkin has got a Saturday show. Giles Corran's got a Friday show. So you can see some of the talent from the Times itself. But really, we need to make use of the newsroom in terms of getting access to stories, getting access to columnists, and getting access to journalists who can come and talk about the stuff they're writing, not only in England but across the devolved countries and also around the world. We have a lot of correspondence around the world that we can tap into. So I think the integration is going to be the trick to making this work. We need to make sure our producers and editors are completely embedded in the newsroom, so they're going to conference, they know what stories are coming up, they can see interesting stuff, we can get people on the radio, and that will give us a certain amount of good high-end content. We also have a podcast that's been launched called Stories of Our Times, which is a daily, slightly longer investigative journalism podcast that will feature a bit in breakfast. So there's another thing we can tap into there. But having said all that, we're then left with being a station that has to look around elsewhere. So there'll be lots of people who come on the station who aren't Times people, pursuing stories that necessarily the Times aren't doing as well. So it's got to work. It's got to be embedded in, otherwise it will not work. So, and that's got to be very central. But then if we get that bit right, then the opportunity to broaden out from that it becomes more straightforward.
So you've started to talk about some of the presenters. Obviously, you're co-hosting breakfast. You look forward to the early mornings?
No, I'm not. And I did it. We've done it a couple of times piloting. It's very weird because it's basically, 3:30 in the morning. You have to start, and you feel quite weird at 10 when you finish. So I'm a bit worried about that. But I mean, it's 4 hours on air. It's a big old thing to do. I'm really lucky. Asma Mir, who's my co-host, is really very good, and she's kind of had the perfect broadcasting experience because she's done Radio 4, she's done 5 Live, but she's done LBC as well. So she's done a whole range of different types of radio, and because the Times radio is quite a combination of different types of radio if you look at it in a certain way. She's very comfortable on the mic, and we're quite comfortable together. That's going to be the thing we have to build, the chemistry, because I've not spent that much time with her. But happily, when we did a 4-hour pilot, any problems that arose weren't to do with the editorial or the relationship. We've got to iron out some technical things, but I feel pretty confident because I'm lucky enough to have someone very good to work with. Absolutely.
So take us through some of the other presenters and also the difference in format.
Yeah.
I was going to say, we'll come on to sort of competition and how you may differ, but maybe hold that for a moment.
Fine. So really, we split the week, Monday to Thursday. Friday is kind of its own day, and then the weekend, or there's a bit of crossover between Friday and the rest of the weekend. And really, the thing we've said all along, we have a sort of document, a brand document, which we created pretty quickly, what we want this to be. And there's sort of several words that we use all the time. I don't want to bore you by banging on about them, but it needs to be warm, it needs to be clever, it needs to be useful to the listener, it needs to be expert-driven. It needs to be a place you can go to find out stuff that's happening immediately around the world and get analysis and get information that's got to be useful to you. It's got to increase your understanding. So we had to find presenters who can carry the load on quite long shows. This is not Radio 4 doing 20-minute shows. These are 3-hour breakfast is 4 hours. Most of the shows are 3 hours. That's a big thing to do. So we have to have people who can manage that. So if you go through the day, breakfast, we have an early morning breakfast with a young guy from Scotland. And what's interesting about this lineup, I think, is there's a pretty good range of ages. It's 50-50 almost in terms of gender. We're okay on diversity. We can get a bit better on that in terms of ethnic diversity, but we have something there, I think, as well. There's more to be done, probably there. But so it starts with an early morning breakfast with a young guy from Scotland called Callum. We have the breakfast show. Matt Chorley's doing politics, which is 10 to 1, which will include PMQs on Wednesday. And that will be, if anyone's heard the Red Box podcast, it will be politics, but done at a slant. He's a stand-up comedian. He's knocked around Westminster for a while. It will be a very light-hearted, but still very factual view of politics. Mariella Frostrup, big beast in the broadcasting world, has come to do an afternoon show in which we'll broaden out. So some people at the beginning thought this was a very, very pure news station, and it isn't. It's a news and politics are the spine of it, but it's current affairs in its broadest possible sense, in the way that you see it in newspapers and websites. It's not just doing politics. It will do lifestyle, it will do health, it will do books and culture, and it will have a sort of slightly broader range. Mariella Frostrup show will be the broadest one in that sense, because in the afternoon it will break news when news needs to be broken. If there's a big political story, it will follow that, but equally it will have a bit of time to move around. The drive shows John Pienaar, one of the biggest political broadcasters of our generation. He's coming in to do the drive show. He's a bit frustrated that he's not been on air for the last 3 months, and he is terrifyingly eager to do it. So I think that first day he'll be bursting over the airwaves, I would imagine, having spoken to him a few times. So that'll be drive, and breakfast will be very newsy, pacey, coming to things that, what happens at the beginning of the day. John will pick it up in the afternoon, evening, to work out what actually has happened. He goes into Phil Williams, who's from 5 Live, be a chance to do a bit of sport, a bit of entertainment. Again, 7 till 10, bit of America, particularly this year as America becomes more and more terrifying and interesting, depending how you look at it. So that show will be a bit broader. And then through till 1 o'clock in the morning, we have Carol Walker, who's a Westminster veteran, and she'll again look at the stories as they're starting to break. And that's the main Monday to Thursday thing. And then on Friday, we will do the same thing. Breakfast. On Friday, the breakfast show happily changes hands, so I'm not doing 5 days of 3:30 starts, where Luke Jones, who's a 24-year-old guy, I think, from Radio 4, will join forces with Jenny Kleeman, who's an investigative journalist. They'll do the breakfast show. Gloria De Piero, the former Labour MP, will come and do her politics show, so it's a nice counterpoint to Matt Chorley, again focusing very much on real people. She's from the Red Wall, the Red Wall constituency, a kind of post-Brexit look at politics and how it actually affects real people. Giles Corran will do a lunchtime afternoon show. Kathy Newman from Channel 4, she's staying on Channel 4, but she'll do a Friday afternoon. So she'll do the John Pienaar slot for Drive, which is pretty exciting. We then have Michael Portillo, whose show is, the piloting of his show has been fantastic. We're very excited about him. He's doing the 7 till 10 on Friday. Then we do an overnight show, and then a couple of things on breakfast. We have Hugo Rifkin doing a Saturday morning show. Gloria will pick up with Tom Newton-Dunn, who's our chief political commentator for the whole station. He'll be on all throughout the week. They have a show called G&T on Sunday, which will be a hopefully slightly more fun version of political shows that you get on Sunday that I don't watch. That one I think should be a nice listen. And then we have a couple of people in the day: Aisha Hazarika, who is a stand-up comedian, formerly advised Ed Miliband, and Alexis Conran, who I love because I'm exactly the right age to have watched his show The Real Hustle when I was a kid, and he's a magician. He's a very, very good broadcaster. I like him a lot. So if you think about that run of people, and I've probably missed a couple of things, it sort of should stand for the best values of the times, which is being a broad church. There's people who've had connections to the Labour Party. There's people who've had connections to the Tory Party. There's people who've worked all over the place. There's a certain age range as well. We don't want to get locked into the discourse that has existed in this country, especially for the last 5 years, of Remoaners versus Brexiteers. We don't want to get hard left versus hard right, shouty, I think this and you're a moron if you disagree with me. We don't want presenters staring down the barrel of the microphone and delivering 50-second monologues for Facebook about why faith schools are a good idea or a bad idea. We want to incorporate ranges of views. We want to believe that people want nuance. They want views that challenge them. They want to be provoked, but they want to be provoked in a reasonable, rational fashion. And so the tone we're going to have to try and strike is, we won't be afraid of tackling tough subjects and subjects where some of the people we'll have on will be punchy, but we don't want it to go to Punch and Judy. We don't want it to become that type of aggressive, polemical approach, because A, that's served pretty well all over the place. It's become the sort of keynote of our discourse. And B, I don't think it actually gets you very far. So I'm hoping we can be a place where it's useful. The idea of utility is very important to me. That if it's just two people shouting, it's not very useful. We've got to try and get to a point where however you're being talked to and communicated with, it will be useful to you.
I've got a question from Alice from CISPress. She wants to know, and it sort of links into sort of like the other national speech-based radio stations.
Yeah.
She'd like to know what you guys consider to be the holes in Radio 4's offer, particularly the Today programme, and how you might have addressed them in your programming.
I mean, the first thing I'd say is that this has not been, although sometimes people try and characterise this as sort of pitching our tanks on Radio 4's lawn, it really isn't. That's how we don't see it that way. Not least because it would be horribly hubristic to take on a network with millions and millions of listeners. We're a startup. I want people to always remember who are working on it. We're a startup. We're a challenger. We need to fight for everything that we can possibly get. The general position, I think, around speech radio is in really robust health. And if you count podcasts also, the idea of audio is really in very robust health. There's a golden age of audio we're living through. And that feels that hasn't hit its ceiling yet. So I think there's room in the marketplace for people who want to get information through the medium of audio. But Radio 4, Radio 5 Live, LBC, they all have different responsibilities that they have either given themselves or have been given. You know, Radio 4 covers a huge waterfront of things. It covers comedy, it covers drama, it covers gardening, it covers all sorts of stuff. 5 Live does sport, LBC does phone-ins. So we don't have to give ourselves any responsibilities like that whatsoever. We're a blank slate. We can really just pursue stories that we're interested in, always be live, always be responsive to them. What I think we can offer that Radio 4 maybe doesn't do so much is, I'm a huge believer in informality. And I think the great revolution of podcasts has led to a certain breaking down of formality. And my very strong belief in life is, if you're clever and you have clever people, you don't need to be too formal. People want warmth, and they don't want to, and you know, if you've been around a long time as a station or any form of industry, you know this, you get given grammar, you get given stuff that you have to follow because you followed it 10 years ago and you followed it 20 years ago, and you do things a certain way. You have an interview at 8:10 because that's what happened 50 years ago. Some editor decided 50 years ago that the big political interviews at 8:10, even though most people by 8:10 are at work or heading off to work and maybe moving on to different things. We don't have any legacy. We don't have any baggage. We can try and do things because they feel like the right thing to do at the right time. And I hope we're going to have people who can sit into the microphone and share their lives. You know, it's very, like I said, I don't want presenters, and I include myself in this, to do 45 seconds down the microphone of a polemical argument. But if we're talking about care homes and my mum is in a care home, I want the presenter to talk about that. If we're talking about race and one of our presenters has an experience of racism, I want them to talk about that without fear of anyone saying you can't do that, because you can do that. Questions of impartiality are a political argument, which we have to be, you know, we're regulated by Ofcom, and we will be careful of that. But that's got nothing to do with personal experience. It's got nothing to do with sharing a bit of yourself. And I really fundamentally believe that radio is the medium for sharing bits of yourself, and then you'll get stuff shared back with you by your listeners. And then when it becomes that community, that communal experience, that's when it really works. So I think we're not shackled by anything, and we're not having to be formal. And I think that, to me, is a big advantage for us.
So what do you, obviously you spent a lot of time on the print side. So what are you enjoying about sort of the broadcast side at the moment that's so different, how it works, how it's put together?
Well, I mean, I've done sort of. I mean, I've had a very weird career, and I've not really done that much of anything for that long. But I mean, radio, I've done. So I presented an LBC show for 3 years, which was a weekend show, which was a phone-in show, and at the weekend you are left on your own. It's you and a producer, and you've got 3 hours to fill, and you better make it work, otherwise you'll be horribly embarrassed. And then after that, I did 3 and a bit years on Front Row, which is Radio 4's flagship arts program, which is a beautifully produced, really magnificent 28-minute program. And on that show, you can talk for 28 minutes. If you talk for 28 minutes and 5 seconds, it will be a disaster. It's very, very tightly produced, which has a massive advantages because it's a very, very lovely thing. So I come to this with a certain amount of different radio experience, something very informal and very based on just giving it a go versus something very formal. And in terms of newspapers that I've worked with, and I should say to James, it just broke my heart by saying it was the LRB I was editor of. It's the TLS, not our horrible rivals at the LRB.
Sorry. A 6 a.m. start.
Yeah, don't worry. But so I've worked in different. The main thing about radio is it's immediate in a way that websites and as print goes towards websites, you get a bit of that, but it's not, even then it's not as immediate as radio. And what I want to foster in the station is if someone has a good idea, it can be on air 5 minutes later or an hour later or later in the day. And actually, we're not over-resourced. You know, some of this chat begins with all the Murdoch millions you hear about. We don't pay better than the BBC, really. The BBC is so super resourced. It pays people an extraordinary amount of money. We are not coming into this as a sort of a big beast who can splash cash that nobody else has. We're doing this where we're going to rely on ingenuity and cleverness and ideas, because we don't have huge teams. We don't have tightly produced 25 minutes documentaries. We have people and ideas. And so the joy of radio, which we have to embrace, so we've got to make a virtue of that necessity and say, we've got to think of the best way of doing something. And if we have a cool idea, we better get it going. And if you talk to Chris Evans, who is on one of our sister stations, Virgin, and I've talked to him quite a lot, he's a big supporter of Times Radio. He's had every presenter of Times Radio on over the last 2 weeks. He's having me on again on Friday because he's so supportive. Because he just loves the idea of new radio, Chris Evans. But he would say when he was at the BBC, if he had an idea, it would get workshopped to death. But on Virgin, if he has an idea, he'll just do it. And I think we just have to try and establish that as a principle for us. Like, have an idea, make it work, and hopefully you'll get great radio, because that's all we have to think about.
So we've got questions coming in. Thanks so much. Keep them coming in. Tweet us at Broadcast Revo. Eden from Nationwide wants to know, what's the appetite in hearing from business leaders, CEOs and the like? You know, where's the sweet spot for Times Radio?
Yeah, I think there is. It's, you know, the Times has got a really good business tradition, as does the Sunday Times, that we would want to maintain in the radio station. There'll always be a business update, big business section of the breakfast show. We're doing a money segment of the breakfast show. We have a thing on Sunday Times called Money Mentor. So there'll be at least half an hour on a Monday will be about money issues, probably a bit more consumer than that, but it will touch on things like mortgages. And it's really sort of how we can be useful to customers to their financial areas. So I feel we're part of a tradition of seeing business as important. And so CEOs, people, you know, this is a very strange world we're living in. And I keep saying this to people, that I'm not really interested in fighting Brexit again. I'm not really, you know, we live in the post-Brexit, post-coronavirus, hopefully, or at least mid-coronavirus, becoming post-coronavirus country. And that's going to have colossal impacts on all sorts of people. So what we want to hear from is people who are going to be shaping what that country looks like. What's the future of mortgages? What's the future of the rental market? What's the future of policing? What's the future of racial equality? These big ideas we can wrestle with, because we've got a bit of space. That's the other thing, that, you know, our clock, which they call it in radio, isn't based on we've got to do 6 minutes, then 6 minutes, then 6 minutes, then the pips, then we've got to have sports news exactly this point. We can embrace the informality a bit of that without becoming too indulgent, and saying, if we've got someone interesting who's telling us stuff that is about how the world is going to change, how they're going to impact on all our lives, we need to give them the space to tell us that. So I think there will be the opportunity to get into people, not for puff pieces, not for to sort of give people an absolute open-end chance to advertise their wares, but to actually say, we're living in the same country that you're living in, we're wrestling with the same problems that you're wrestling with, and this is what we're trying to do. And I think, again, that comes back to this question of utility. Is it going to be useful for listeners to hear that?
And sort of as a bit of a follow-up, Mona from Royal London, she says, you mentioned journalists coming on to talk about their own stories. So if that story was basically from a corporate, would you also have the corporate on to talk about the story?
It's possible. And in fact, one of the things we're working through with the Times is exactly that. Either if someone's written a story about, say there's a CEO interview in the Times, I think it's interesting and there's a story there, I think we'd want to speak to the person themselves rather than the journalist. I think it will depend on what's accessible and how it works, but yes, the answer to that is basically yes. This is true actually of all stories, that sometimes the journalist will be the best person, sometimes we'll talk to the people the journalists have already spoken to, because that gives us a route in.
Now, another question we've got is, as far as planning goes, so will all the items be fixed on the day, or will you be forward planning? I'd like to think you'll forward plan an element of it, but then
why? Yeah. I hope so.
Exactly.
No, there's an edit. So it's relative. There's a editorial team who will be involved in planning. So there'll be the producers of each show, and they will be involved in forward planning their shows. But above them will also be editors who are looking at the whole schedule. So absolutely, particularly for breakfast, you have a 4-hour show. You don't want to be, not least for the first hour and a half of that. You're really, that starts at 6. So you have to get that pretty much nailed down by 5. You don't want to be doing that. You don't want to be trying to find people at 5 o'clock in the morning very often, very successfully in this country. You can do it a bit around the world, but it's very hard in this country. So yeah, I would like to think that where there's predictable events, we can certainly plan the day before, but also look more long-term than that. Again, we have to make things efficiently in this station because we're a startup. And so absolutely we need to be planning things ahead.
Can I just move on to the whole sort of gender split? You talked about it as far as your presenters go, as far as diversity, female, ethnic minorities, etc. Obviously, yep. BBC, I think Sky would say the same. Most broadcasters talk about the 50-50 split as far as guests go. Whether it's formally or informally, sort of, will Times Radio be taking a similar stance to the guests it has on?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, when I took over the TLS, just as an example, it was 80-20 male-female contributors. And then for the last 3 years, it's been 50-50. And I think this year at the moment, it's slightly 52-48 in favour of women. So if you're inheriting a tradition that I did, you've got to work really hard to change that because people get the same people and therefore it's quite hard to shift. We're starting again afresh. But yeah, we've got an event in the business with the Culture Diversity Network within News UK tomorrow to discuss this point. We've got to keep saying it to ourselves. It's no use just sort of saying we'll try and then leave it to yourself. My experience of the TLS, you've got to really commit to it. And so everyone who's working on it is aware of that and they will commit to it. And we've just got to make sure that that works. And we'll be using Times people, so some of it's reliant on who the Times people have, but that's not an excuse. We can't just give that to ourselves as an excuse. We've got to make sure that we think about that all the time. Not least because, again, I'm a big believer in audience. Audiences need to be able to hear people like them. They need to be able to hear people who have some connection to them, whatever that might be. If you only have a station of blokes, why would a woman listen to it? I'm not saying that I don't really believe in female and male subjects. I don't really like that idea. I like the idea of men and women equally contributing to something, because I think when you get that, you'll end up with an audience that splits the right way. And we've got to build an audience. We want 100% of people to be able to listen to this, or to be inclined to listen to this, at least in theory, and then start working from there.
I think what's interesting, probably for the audience to hear, is that if you're offered, on a given subject, if you are offered, on paper at least, a white middle-aged man or a woman or somebody who's ethnically diverse, and again, let's be clear, you're probably judging that on names and paper, are you likely, therefore, to take the female guest or the ethnically diverse guest?
I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it, because I think you've got to think about it across the whole network and across the day. You've got to get the person that you most want to speak to. But equally, I know this from various things, that this is true of book reviewing. It's true if you talk to producers of radio stations. If you call a man up, they'll generally say yes. And they'll say, even if they don't know anything about it, they'll say, oh yeah, I can do that, I'll do that. If you call a woman up and ask it, sometimes they'll say, I'm not sure I'm the right person to do this. It's a generalization, and I'm sure it's changing, but that's what we would talk to a radio producer, they would say. The answer to that isn't just to go to the guy who's going to say yes. The answer is to work harder to find the right people and work out who the right people are and get them. And if it's not that person, think of someone else and get them. I don't want to think about it as saying, what if you do that, you see, you don't have to worry about the white middle-aged man not having him, because you're confident that across the piece, across your show, across your network, you're getting a wide range of people. And then you can genuinely choose based on what is right for that particular story. The problem you get to is if you're constantly worried about an imbalance and having to hit a quota to correct the imbalance, you make decisions that you otherwise wouldn't make. If you start with a good faith and the proper intention and the commitment, it should free you up to go for the right people, because you know the right people in the round will be 50-50 male-female, for example, because you're doing it with the right way. You're not saying, well, we've had lots of men, we better find a woman. You say, we want the right people, and that's 50-50. And that's, of course, it should be 50-50, because otherwise, it's mad to think it wouldn't be.
Yeah. We've got a lot of universities online watching, and they're all asking the same question. So your views on how best to get their academics, as experts, as commentators, onto stations like yourself.
Yeah, we really want to be the station of experts. I think that's really important to us, because that's what I think we're trying to be. If you turn onto the Times Radio at any time, you should be hearing a clever presenter thinking about something important, talking to people who know what they talk about. So getting in touch with us, our editorial team, it'll be very straightforward. I can give you some names afterwards that you can share. But it's a small team, again, we make a virtue of that. So you won't be in a vast long queue of people having to think about it. It'll be 3 or 4 people who you can speak to. I think all we want is people who are good on air. And I know this again from the TLS. There is a Venn diagram of very clever academics and academics who can write really well, and you want that thing in the middle, because you don't want an academic, and I'm talking about book reviewing for a moment. You don't want academics who can't speak the language. And one of the curses of academia, I can tell you this from editing the TLS for 4 years, is the rise of jargon and gobbledygook, because it's what people get their PhDs checked on, and it means they're not encouraged to think and write beautifully. They're encouraged to think and write in the form of a certain jargon that fits the mystery of their profession. It's awful, it's terrible, because you end up locking out clever people because they can't communicate. So we want academics who can talk like normal people, because if you're really clever, a test of your cleverness is your ability to communicate broadly. So I'd be thrilled to have people from universities in. Actually, we're going to be looking quite often at the future of universities, how universities will work, and the role and function of them. But I think academics who can talk and can be brilliant, and if they're brilliant and warm, they'll have a home on here. And I'm quite keen to develop a family of people, actually. For each show, I'm thinking about Breakfast, my own show, I'd love it if we have 40 or 50 contributors who come on all the time, because I think listeners can then say, oh, I've heard that person before, I like that person, I can see why they've got them on again. And you build that sense of community. And I think for a breakfast show, that's really important. I want people to turn on the radio and feel they're part of the gang, and they know who's there. My formative radio experience was when I was a teenager. Radio 1 had a show Mark Radcliffe presented with Mark Riley. It was called the Mark and Lard Show. They did a breakfast show eventually, which didn't really work. But their evening show at 10 till 12 was this fantastic, clever, warm, funny thing. They had a rolling routine of guests who were really good. I was 15, 16 doing GCSEs at the time, so 10 till 12 was quite a nice hour for me. But I always think about that when I think about radio, actually. I think of that sense of community, of finding people that you want to listen to, And then we've got to build that, and we've got to build that up, I think.
Thanks for all the questions. I'm going to try and get through as many as we can. We've got a question around the pandemic. So how's the pandemic affected plans for the station, particularly with respect to content and stories?
Yeah, well, when I came on board this in sort of October of last year, I was thinking, oh, this would be a really difficult thing to do. I'm not sure I'm really the right man to do it. And then, of course, by the time I got to January, I was like, oh, this really is a difficult thing to do. It wasn't difficult before. I was just naive. Planning it in a pandemic has been difficult. Getting people to come and join when there's economic uncertainty is not easy. The actual planning process has been very Zoomy like this, which has been all right. We're into studios now. That's been fine. But if you go into the News UK building, I'm sure it's the same at any of your places if you're in the office. 2/3 of the desks are unusable. They have red stickers on them saying, don't sit here. You can't get a big group of people together in a room. That's a real pain in the arse. And we're trying to, again, if I'm trying to build this community, if everyone's at home the whole time or can only come in for 3 hours here, then they have to leave so someone else can take a desk. That's not ideal. So that's slowed us down. The virtue that we're taking from that necessity is we're coming out of lockdown at the same time as everyone else is. We're doing the same things as everyone else. We're trying to navigate the new world. We're trying to think about the virtues of home living versus coming into the office as everyone else is. We're thinking about the worry about their economic future as everyone else is and our health. So we're part of everyone's lives because we're doing the same thing. That's been good. On a story basis, it's a really good point that one of our pilots we've done and Breakfast, there's a lot of health stories. There's a lot of coronavirus stories. And you've got to strike the balance because what you want to do is you want to be talking about the things that matter to people. So with my old LBC hat on, they would always tell you, and this is a really good advice, it's not about entertaining you. If the thing that people want to hear is the 2 meter rule going down to 1 meter and what it means, just because you did it an hour ago, most people won't listen for 2 out of 3 hours. They'll be coming in, they'll be dropping out. You're not there to make yourself interested. You're there to talk about the things that people want to talk about. So we have to, I think that's a really good advice that I have in my mind. But we equally want to make sure we don't neglect other stories. I mean, one of the crises that comes out of coronavirus is how it has obliterated everything else. And all of the things that we worried about before February still exist. They've probably been exacerbated in lots of respects, but certainly they're still as big as ever. They just look small because there's this giant thing next to them. And I think we've got to try and keep that in our minds as well, that there'll be all sorts of things that need talking about that we're not talking about. So it's a combination, I think, of adding difficulty, but it's also a great time to be doing radio. People will be looking for comfort and information and company and all of those things. Even as we unlock, people will probably be at home still a bit more. They'll be in their cars more than they will be on public transport. There'll be more, I think radio actually will have a more significant role. So there's upsides and downsides, I think.
But obviously with radio figures going through the roof at the moment through lockdown, you know, again, hopefully good time for you guys to start with a strong audience. Just want to pick up on your point around coming out of lockdown, you guys now going back into studio. I say going back, you know, starting in studio. Obviously, you know, over the last 12, 14 weeks, guests that we put onto radio, it's all via Skype in the main. How long do you think, and I'm sure it's just an educated guess, it will be before the likes of Times Radio are inviting contributors, guests into studio? Or do you think that actually broadcast may be changing, that the old days of, you know, we can't have you on the telephone line are gone and now it can all just be done remote?
I've always believed, because I came from an LBC background, I don't like the BBC fussiness about lines that much. Because I think if someone's great, you should get them.
Yeah.
And I think phone lines maybe, but there are other things now, yeah. FaceTime and Skype, that gets you better in quality. So I think that should be an opportunity, because it's a big difference asking someone to sit for 5 minutes in their home and talk to you on quality versus getting in a cab, coming into the office, waiting around because you've been delayed, and then only getting 3 minutes rather. I mean, we won't be like that, but it's the same, you know, it's an inconvenience. So I think that looking at how the radio business is working generally, I think we'll be slowish to have people in the studio. Although on the counter, I would say this: I do Sky papers once a week. I hate doing it on Skype. I hate it. It's rubbish. And we have to be conscious that we're looking for the best product in the end. And no one would pretend that particularly discussions are better outside of a studio. They're just not. Particularly with more than 2 people, because you then have, you know, you and I can talk. That's pretty similar. If it was 3 of us talking, it wouldn't be as good if we were doing it like this, because you can't interact. You can't interrupt politely. You're on a delay. So I feel that there'll be an impetus to get some things back in the studio, but there'll also be a recognition of, you know, I was looking at GMB yesterday, and they had the Reverend Al Sharpton on from America with is it Paul Hutchinson, the guy who was photographed rescuing the I don't know what the euphemism we're using, the counter protester or the whatever he was, the white guy with the Black Lives Matter thing that he rescued. I thought it was a really good bit of casting. You know, Al Sharpton, this great figure of the civil rights movement, American, and this guy who's become famous for very good reasons in Britain, a British guy and an American guy. They wouldn't have been able to do that really very easily in the pre-lockdown world, because, you know, it'd be harder to get people together, and it'd be a bit more logistically difficult. So I think there's an opportunity we've got to seize there, but I'm not one of these people that believe the future of everything is Skype, because I think you lose some stuff as well.
Great question from Sophie. See how well you'll answer this one. You mentioned that you're trying to broaden your usual Times audience. So on the one hand, who are you really trying to target on top of that? But also, how many listeners are you hoping to attract in your first year?
Great question. I'm not going to answer the second one. We have 2 metrics that's worth bearing in mind for us. We're not the same as other radio stations. There is an audience figure, and this has got to work as a national audience. There's a conversion figure to Times subscription, and that number's more economically significant to us, or as economically significant to us. So actually, we've got to be careful that we are introducing people to Times in a good way. And that's exactly right. The broadening the Times audience. The Times is a really solid, respected brand that's been around for 235 years. And yet, there's still a whole swathe of people in the country who don't think about it at all. They're neutral on it. Or they read it 20 years ago, they thought about it 20 years ago, and they haven't done it since. Or there might be people who aren't used yet to paying for news. And that's one of the big cultural challenges in our country. I think the people who will pay for news in our country is much less than, say, America. And I think we're getting to a point, though, where journalism costs a lot of money. People, if they want something that's been done well, will have to become acclimatized to the idea of paying for a certain amount of their news. So one of our roles will be to reach an audience who are not bothered about the Times, don't know anything about it, not used to the idea of a subscription service. We want to attract a whole range of people from a young age all the way through. We don't need to super serve the Times audience that already exists. We need to make them happy, and we want them to like us, which I hope they will do, and they'll find some of their familiar faces on the station. But really, we want to reach a bunch of people who aren't thinking about the Times at all at the moment. And they might be not locked into a particular radio station already. They might be a bit bored of one because they've listened to it for a long time. They might be a bit tired of it. They might feel it doesn't always carry a plurality of views in the way they want it to. They might, there's all sorts of things that we might try and get people. But we want to broaden out those who are thinking about the Times properly for the first time. And ultimately, to succeed commercially, we need to make them like that brand enough to become accustomed.
We've got a question around social media. Like, will you have a strong social media presence? And if so, what sort of form will that take?
We will have a social media presence, although there's a tension here. Like I said, we're not doing the down the barrel of the camera 45-second monologues for Facebook clicks.
Yeah.
So we're not doing that. But the studio is visualized. So there's a possibility for clips. We want to engage people on social media. We're not having phone-ins, but we do want customer interaction. So texts, but mainly tweets and other social media interactions will be quite important for us, because we want people to join the conversation and the debate. What we don't want to do is set it up as an adversarial phone-in. So we're not going to do that. So having engagement on social media will be important. Having highlights on social media will be important. We use social media to introduce the presenters, I think starting today. So I think we'll always feel like we could have more resource put in that, because we don't have unlimited resources. But social media will be important for us, and we have to get the tone of that right, I think.
We've got a question, again, you touched on it earlier on, around the regions. Lydia, who's based in Wales, she'd love to help you build an audience in Wales, providing great stories. like, again, are you looking specifically in the regions for that sort of support from local knowledge to provide that insight?
Yeah, and actually this goes beyond just the regions, but let's talk about the regions. Absolutely right. We want to reflect the issues as they are in all the regions. You know, when we did our pilot on Tuesday, Asma and I, we were talking about the social distancing rules, and we had to be very clear. They weren't being changed in Wales. They weren't being changed in Scotland. They'd already been changed in Northern Ireland, I think, at that point. And so you've got to, particularly on these big national stories in inverted commas, you've got to recognise that nations are all different. The Times has a good presence in Scotland and a pretty good presence in Ireland, which we'll be making use of. Wales less so, so we'll have to work on that. But it's exactly right. We want to reflect life as it is, not just as we experience it if we live in London. That will be a test. If you look at our presenter lineup, we're fairly broadly have geographic origins. So Gloria is a Midlander, but she really has lived in the Midlands, and she applied her trade having to listen to the concerns of Midlanders. I'm from the Midlands, Asma's Scottish. We're doing a show out of Manchester. Our Phil Williams show is out of Manchester, so that's being broadcast there every day. We'll come down to London a little bit, but it's a Manchester show. We need to make sure we think particularly of the devolved regions and make sure we come there, but also we get people from there. Scotland, I think, could be more straightforward in the first instance because Times Scotland is a good enterprise. They've done well in Scotland. The Times has and the Sunday Times. So we'll make use of they've got offices there, they've got studios there, so we can make use of that. And then, but no, it's exactly right. Regionality is very important. And then I'm very keen on this point, which I don't know if this is any of interest to this audience, but I think it's to an audience, I think it's interesting, is if you look at the competition, they're not very global. LBC doesn't really do foreign news. 5 Live doesn't really do foreign news. Radio 4 does The World Tonight, but doesn't really do much of it because they've got the World Service, which is brilliant. But outside of that, we can say, I'm very keen on getting people, we've got correspondents all around the world. The best thing they can do, in my opinion, is if they've got a story, tell us the story. After that, tell us what it's like to be in that country. What are the 3 biggest stories happening in Germany at the minute? What's the 3 biggest stories happening in South Korea? At the minute, a lot of it will be coronavirus and how we're handling things differently, which is interesting. But as life progresses, I'm very struck by the fact that we can introduce to people, if you were living in Germany today, the thing you would be talking about wouldn't be what we're talking about. It would be something completely different. And that's quite an exciting idea. And I find if we get some people we can bring into the family, so you know who the Berlin correspondent of the Times is, they're good on the air. And once or twice a week, you'll hear them saying, you know, what's blown up in Germany at the minute is this. And that sort of thing, I think, is actually of use to people and of interest as well.
Great question coming from Pam. She wants to know about the commercials. Will there be advertising on air? How long will the longest ad break be? And how frequent? And will every show be sponsored?
So no ad breaks at all. The commercial part is about sponsorship. So we're interested in businesses who will have they might want to sponsor a show. B, they might want to have a deeper relationship with the company. So Wireless is part of News UK. It's also, we're connected to TNL, which is the company that owns the Times. It's all the same company, really. So the possibility to do what they call solutions-based advertising across different media is really key. But the pillar of that for the radio will be sponsorship and the ability to have integrated sponsorship. You know, presenter reads, sponsor of the show, but then also an item in the show that reflects back on your business. So if your business is particularly interested in conservation or that type of thing, you could sponsor a show, but also have an item in the show that touches upon conservation. It won't then be a kind of, here's your CEO who gets a 5-minute chance to talk about the value of your products every day. But if it's a value of your business that relates to a story or a subject that's interesting, the possibility to build that into a sponsorship of the show. So for people who are used to non-commercial radio stations, and 80% of the speech market is currently the BBC, they won't be off-put by every 15 minutes a load of jangly ads for hardware stores or stuff like that. We haven't got any of them. But commerciality is important to us, but we want to build a relationship. So for launch, we've got 3 brands who I can't say who are engaged to sponsor different shows. They won't actually start on air for launch. But I also think that the big shows, I think we want to establish them as shows, and then the opportunity to partner really with an organisation. This is all about values, actually, for us in terms of commercial sponsors, because we ultimately want people who share what we're doing, and the brand fits, and it fits with their long-term strategy. It might fit with a broader partnership with News UK, which has all these titles and these radio stations. The opportunity to do something quite significant with brands that kind of want to be associated with us. I do feel that we're going to be quite a safe place for brands. I think we're a nice place for brands. I think we are starting with an intent. You know, we are trying ultimately to create a station that will draw people in to buy our own products. You know, that's quite important. So you can feel safe that we're not going to do anything that damages that, because it's against our self-interest anyway. And I'm hoping that that's what will become attractive to advertisers. Not for it to buy a 30-second spot, but to have a slightly longer term relationship with us.
And as we come towards the end, I've got a question from James. What's your view on sort of, research-led stories from a PR perspective?
Yeah, I think like everything, it depends on the quality of it. We'd be up for it if it's interesting and it tells us something new. I'm not so keen on the ones you get on page 13 of the Mail because it's an easy filler. We've got to be a bit careful that we don't do that. One thing we've got to be really careful. It's a really good point that we have to say, because we're not over-resourced, and because we've got a lot of time to take up, and because we're new and all of those things, we've got to make sure we're not doing stuff that's too easy, that it's too easy to get 5 minutes on how many eggs people eat a day now in lockdown. I think with all these things, it wants to be considered. Yeah. And we won't turn down anything snobbishly because we're not thinking about it, but we also need to make sure we can get something good out of it. So I think that's the question, all like, can we get depth and breadth? Is it going to be a useful piece of radio for us?
I think James has got a question.
Yeah, I think I hope it's not a dumb question, but how do we listen? What frequency are you on?
Presumably... it's not a dumb question. No, I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for us in some ways. We're on DAB, so we're not on FM or AM, so you can't get us by tuning your radio to that. We're on DAB. We're on the Times app you can download. You should download. It's a free app. It's all free. It's another message we need to get. Times is now very associated with the paywall.
Yeah.
It's important we emphasise how free this is. It's completely free to air, but we're on DAB. So we're in most cars. We're on DAB settings. If you turn your DAB, I think from today actually, alphabetically, we're at Times Radio. We're on smart speakers mostly, although there's a bit of a wobble on that. The thing about smart speakers I've just learned is we're in most of them, but smart speakers rely on people actually asking for it before it can really establish it. So it's almost a chicken and egg thing. You need to have lots of people asking for Times Radio before Times Radio becomes the default setting. We can work a bit on that, but that's true of Alexa. We're on smart speakers. There's one where we're just nearly there. But yeah, website, app, DAB, smart speakers. That's where you can get it. It's a great question, James, and I've spoken for 57 minutes blathering on, and I haven't mentioned it once. So it shows you why you're in the business of conveying useful information, and I'm not very good at it yet.
Shows what a great interview I am as well. Listen, my last question to you, Stig, slightly cheeky. Money no object. If there was one person you could have on the roster of presenters moving forward, who would be your pick?
Barack Obama.
Okay.
I'd take him. I think he'd be quite useful.
Nice. Stig, thank you so much. I hope everybody's enjoyed it. I found it genuinely fascinating. I can't wait to tune in on Monday. I'll be there at 6, I promise.
So will I promise.
Exactly. Thank you to everybody. Do continue to follow us on Twitter @BroadcastBravo for more events. Thanks everyone, and do tune into Times Radio, and good luck with the launch, Stig.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Stig. Thank you, everyone.